Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating the 7th YouTube session of the 9th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 11 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project and violence against women by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now, we have a very special guest for today's live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session. And here he is, the multi-award winning author of horror and supernatural thrillers and dark fantasy, Alan Baxter. Alan is also a martial arts expert, a whiskey-soaked swear monkey, and dog lover. He creates dark and weird stories among the dairy paddocks on the beautiful south coast of New South Wales, Australia. Alan has also very generously donated some truly fabulous goodies to the stash of author treats we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page, including, now, there are two lots of goodies. The first lot are two different goodies that are for donors in the US and Australia only. So the first one is Alan is gifting the opportunity to name a minor character in his next horror novel. So this is an exclusive Tuckerization bundle for one very generous Read for Pixels donor in the US or Australia, which includes the opportunity to name a minor character who dies in a memorably grisly death scene in his next novel. Alan will make sure your death scene will be one that is talked about by horror fans for years to come. And if you love reading horror, yeah, you have an idea about what's coming. Or the level of what's coming. And also, Alan will send you a first edition copy of the book with a signed book plate when it is released to keep as a memento. And the second goodie is Alan's Scary Good Horror Goodie Bundle. This is an exclusive treat, again, for one US or Australia-based Read for Pixels donor. So you get one copy of The Gulp, which was released last year, wasn't it, Alan, or is it this year?
There it is there, that one behind me. Yeah, it was released at the start of 2021 and the sequel was The Fall came out this year. So The Gulp is the first one of that duology, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a paperback edition. And there'll be one set of 6 postcards with a variety of different book covers, including The Gulp and The Fall, all signed. One Blind Eye Moon sticker from The Gulp and one General Alan Baxter book sticker. And a note for both the perk and the bundle. For donors in Australia, Alan will sign a personalized book directly for you. You still get the book plate. But for donors in the US, Alan will send you a signed book plate to go with the book, which will arrive separately. That's because Alan's all the way in Australia, and mail from Australia, it's not only gets expensive.
Postage internationally is a killer.
Yeah, and also it's it takes ages to get from Australia to the US. We're speaking from experience. During the 2 years of COVID. It took a grand 6 months for one Australian author's books to get to the US because of all the logistical difficulties. So
it's getting a little bit better again now, but it's still a bit of a nightmare.
So it's actually faster for Alan to order the book if you're in the US, to order the book to get to you, and then send you the book plate and whatever goodies go with it. So it'll work faster that way. And if Alan ever takes a trip to the US, in your
come and see me and I'll find something else for you.
Yeah, bring your book with you. Yeah. And also, now, if you're anywhere in the world, Alan also has a goodie for that, for anyone worldwide. So it's his 30-minute Zoom session for writers. So if you're a novice horror or supernatural thriller author struggling with making sure that the spooky factors of your stories are on point, Alan is offering this session, which features an intensive workshop during which you can ask Alan for his secrets and solutions for the challenges of writing truly scary stories of horror and pulse-pounding thrillers, which is more difficult to do than most people would expect, actually, especially pacing, I think. Alan is also happy to answer general questions about writing and publishing if you have them. The workshop will be conducted in English, and there's only one of this workshop, but it is open to individual writers, writing pairs, or writing groups. Now, we've raised $1,830 towards our modest $5,000 goal so far, and we kind of stalled. So if anyone would like to donate to the Rally Up fundraiser, please do, because please help us get the momentum going again. And the fundraiser will end in October 2022, which is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So it's all very appropriate. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And now, if you are watching this session on YouTube, you will also be able to ask Alan questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to put it out on screen and read out for Alan to answer. And now over to Alan. Welcome to Read for Pixels, Alan. Alan will be reading a very, very powerful excerpt for us today which features domestic violence. So we are going to issue a content warning for strong language and also domestic violence. If you feel that this is going to might trigger you, if you're a survivor and this might trigger you, you can go off for the next 10 minutes, get a cup of tea, get your coffee, come back for the discussion after Alan has read out the excerpt. So over to you, Alan. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No worries, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm going to read, it's from this one. This is my latest novel, Sallow Bend, just came out basically a month ago, give or take a few days, I think. It's the newest thing. Just to give it a bit of context, I'm going to read two excerpts, one from chapter 2 and one from chapter 8. So to give you some context of the reading, the story starts with two teenage girls who have gone missing from the small town of Sallow Bend. And obviously the whole town is concerned. It's a small country town. The community comes together and everybody's out searching for these two missing teenagers. I won't go into more of what happens during the course of the story because, of course, that's what the story is. But the story is told mainly from the point of view of a character called Caleb Jackson, who's the school janitor. But he ends up teaming up with a woman called Trisha Brent. And so Trisha's story is a very sort of integral part of the whole book. So the first excerpt is going to be the first that we hear from Trisha from chapter 2, and then I'm going to skip and read another bit from a bit later on in her story from chapter 8. So I'll just kick off, and excuse me from looking, I'm reading off my screen above the camera, so it's easier for me to read that way. So here we go, from chapter 2 of Sallow Bend. Trisha Brent bit down on rising rage, tried to quench the fire of hatred that burned in her gut. Riley stood there, so drunk already he swayed slightly, his idiot face twisted in confusion. What do you mean? Why does it have to be me? She asked, voice low with a threat of explosion. Exactly that, Riley slurred. What business is it of yours? Trisha looked her husband up and down, his burly frame gathering fat around the middle. He wasn't 40 yet, but he was thickening, balding, increasingly bitter by the day. She was no teenage beauty anymore herself. She knew that, but she kept better care of herself than he did. She was still fit, even if she was a few pounds over where she'd like to be. And she didn't drink, not like Riley. No one she knew drank like Riley, like he had ever since Toby disappeared. Children are missing, she said. How can you not understand that? I understand it. I just don't know why you got to get involved. Because they're children, Riley, because we lost our own son and you don't want me to care about that anymore. He took a stagger step towards her and she rapidly backed up, bracing for a strike. He'd hit her before, then begged forgiveness in a brief moment of sobriety. His logger's hands were rough and cracked, hard as the wood he felled, and his head was full of sawdust. He frightened her. Those missing girls ain't going to lead you to Toby. He raised a hand, grimaced, and let it fall again. How do you know that? And besides, I know how their mothers feel. If nothing else, we have to come together as community to help each other. He sneered and turned away, snatched a bottle of wild turkey from the counter as he stumbled back towards his beaten old lazy boy in front of the TV, drinking away his day off. You do as you damn well please, woman. You always do. Tricia stood trembling, staring at the back of his pale head as he slumped into the seat and clicked the remote to show a football match. They'd been so in love, high school sweethearts, infatuated with each other, both born and raised in Sallow Bend. They'd waited a long time to have kids, enjoying each other's company. Then finally Toby was born, and that had been wonderful too, for a dozen good years more, until Toby disappeared and Riley fell into a bottle and never found his way out. She'd lost them both, she knew that. But while Toby seemed gone forever, Riley was a bad smell that would never air out. She'd switched their places in an instant. Her eyes roamed over the familiarity of their home, muted autumn colours in the soft furnishing, some of her artworks on the walls, worn but good quality furniture, the white and pine kitchen, the lived-in untidiness of it all. She felt as though she were looking through a screen now, as though she'd been partially removed from her nest. Riley lived in the family home, and she gently slipped away from it, watching it fade like the closing shot of a movie. They weren't well off, but they were far from poor. Riley made good money, though for how long, given his current decline, she couldn't be sure. She did okay at the grocery store 4 days a week. Even without Toby, if they held together, they should have been able to weather the loss, keep looking for him as a team, never give up, have each other and their comfortable home in the meantime. But Riley was drinking all that away. Screw that, she muttered under her breath, swept her purse off the counter and left. So that's the first part. That's our introduction to Tricia Brent. And then the story continues. And now I'm going to read from Riley's point of view, from the start of chapter 8, as things have slid further. Riley Brent was a man consumed by guilt, slowly drowning in alcoholism. He knew these two things to be true, and he also knew he was too much of a coward to do anything about either one. And yet, Tricia, his wife of so many years, made him furious despite these moments of self-awareness. Why couldn't she simply let it be? These girls may or may not come back. What difference did it make? He knew for a fact it would do nothing to return Toby to their home. He swallowed the old sensation like a rock in his throat and turned his anger outwards again to protect himself from further self-reflection. What do you plan to achieve? He demanded. Tricia stared at him, brows creased in hurt confusion. She'd been so beautiful when they were younger. She still retained the traces of that beauty, aged a little, but no less striking, except when she looked at him like this, and that just made her ugly. Achieve? She managed finally. You're letting this consume you. They're gone. 2 missing girls. So sad. They may come back. They may not. How can you not care? Tricia shook her head, threw aside the piece of toast she'd been holding as our appetite had suddenly deserted her. If nothing else, it's simply being a good neighbour. They're not our neighbours. Everyone in Sallow Bend is our neighbour, Riley. It's a small enough town as it is without losing more. Decent people care about each other. Oh, and I'm not a decent person now, is that it? Riley ground his teeth. He needed a damn drink. He'd take another sick day. Work be damned. The boss had intimated that too many more sick days or any more drinking on the job would mean he had no more job to go to. So be it. Screw that guy. Screw everything. Images of Toby flitted past his mind's eye, his young son's wide eyes and mouth open in a horrified O of shock. Riley bit back a sob. No, Riley, Tricia said in a dangerously low voice. You are not a decent person. You used to be a strong man, a good father. Now you're weak and broken and unkind. She stepped close, stared up at him with fury in her eyes. You need help, Riley Brent. You need professional help before you drink yourself to death. See a psychiatrist. Red slid down over Riley's vision, a waterfall of rage. How dare she? He struck out, undecided between a punch and a slap, so a half-open hand cracked into the back of her head as she frantically ducked. Something in his middle finger clicked, the knuckles of 2 more bending painfully against her skull instead of the face that he's intended. She cried out, as much in anger as pain, it sounded like. Riley shook out his stung hand, angrier than ever, and clenched his fist tight. You don't talk to me like that, he yelled, and hauled back to hit her properly. Tricia danced sideways and swung a savage kick up between his legs. He tried to turn his thigh against it, but only managed a half block. The top of her foot ground into one testicle. Nauseating pain shot into his belly. He half yelled, half gagged, went down on one knee. Bitch! He managed, and then something heavy crashed into the side of his head. Blackness, punctuated by coloured light, sparkled across his vision, and the carpet was dragging roughly against his cheek. He coughed, blinked, tried to pull himself up again, but everything was watery and uncertain. Tricia stood over him, the wooden chopping board from the kitchen counter held in one hand, raised ready to hit him again. He went onto one elbow, lifted the other arm to fend off the blow, but it didn't come. "You never raise a hand to me again," Tricia said through tears. "You get out of this house, I don't care where you go, but you don't come back until you've got professional help and stopped drinking." He stared up at her, blinking through the pain in his head, the continued throb in his balls that made his stomach churn. Rage fell away and disgust rose. Grief rose. Toby's face falling away from him over and over again. "You have to face up to what happened," Tricia said. "You need to deal with the fact that Toby is missing. You need to help me. We need to never stop looking, but you have to face it." If only she knew what he'd done, what he was. If only he knew what had really happened. Tears ran over his cheeks and Tricia's face softened slightly, but her eyes were still hard with anger. She threw the slab of smooth red oak back onto the counter, where it landed with a surprisingly loud bang that made him flinch. "If you promise me you're going to get help, you can stay," she said. "But if you won't, I want you gone before I get home. I'm going out again to help look for Claire and Suki, and I'll never stop looking for Toby." She turned and left. After the front door slammed and the sound of her car's engine faded up the street, Riley collapsed to the carpet and sobbed like a baby. And their story, and more of the story of Sally Bend, develops further during the course of the book.
That was really good, and I can absolutely guarantee that Tricia is probably shaking inside with fear when she's doing all that. Because
the fallout from it and her reaction to it follows up in the following chapter, and she struggles with everything that's going on and finds some solace in the new friendship she's got with Caleb and searching for the two girls. So
so everyone, if you can get hold of a copy of Sally Bend, get it if you're intrigued by what Alan has just read. And that was as good as any of a portrayal of domestic violence, actually. So let's talk about your female characters. Your books feature some memorable female characters, including Detective Abby Jones from Hidden City, Carly Sykes from Manifest Recall, and Tricia Brent, who we just heard a bit about from your latest book, Sally Bend. And they are all complex characters of agency. So what or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
Well, to be honest, in much the same way that inspiration for all my writing just really comes from life around me. I'm fortunate enough to have been surrounded by strong and capable women. My mum was a good mum and looked after us. My wife is a wonderful person and a strong woman. And I've just always been fortunate enough to know good, strong, capable women with agency and, with kindness and all those sort of features that we hope to find in any person that we spend time with. And so for me, when I'm writing, I try to make sure that my stories reflect the world that I have around me. And that's a world populated by all kinds of different people, including women.
And, it seems that horror as a genre in both modern and folk storytelling has traditionally not been kind to female figures and characters. So women are portrayed as everything from murderers, for example, Lizzie Borden and Dracula's Handmaidens, to victims. Countless horror movies can attest to that. But Detective Jones, Carly, and Tricia, however, follow the mode of Ellen Ripley from Alien. They are proactive and tough-minded when dealing with the horrors that they encounter. And it's all not their choice to do it, but they just rise to the occasion anyway, and they hit it out the park. What are some of the methods that you have used to subvert female stereotypes and tropes in horror when creating and writing your female characters?
You're right, really. Historically, and certainly in horror, not just in horror, across many genres, and I suppose it's largely a product of publishing being so massively skewed to male writers. But particularly in horror, a lot of the time, women are there to just to kind of further the plot, or to be motivation for a male character rather than being characters in their own right, which is it's just lazy writing, frankly, a lot of the time. So, and you mentioned Ellen Ripley as an excellent example of a character who is a character in her own right, who is central to the story, who happens to be a woman, and that's basically what we need more of, and what I try to do more of is just not have all the main characters being guys, you know, like, because in real life a lot of the main characters are women. Women are, you know, they're sort of central to their own stories, the same as anyone else's. And so I like to basically write the heroes and the villains with sort of, you know, equal representation and equal agency, and that's it is characters like Ellen Ripley, those sorts of characters are a great inspiration for that. It's too lazy if all you're using women for is to be a victim, or to be you know, a motivation. There's so many stories about, you know, especially horror stories and thrillers and stuff, about guys who are driven to do something because of something that happened to the women in their lives, and so that's their motivation. And you know, a lot of the time it will be a rape or a murder that motivates the guy to do something, and it's tired now, you know, it's lazy, it's become very boring. Whereas a lot of the time women can be motivated to be the heroes of their own stories without the need for rape or murder, and to just be motivated in myriad different ways, like so many male heroes have been over the years.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about Ripley, just an aside here, is that I think James Cameron had talked about this in an interview once, that he originally wrote Ripley as male,
Ah.
and then when the final decision came, when it came down to the final decision, he just switched over to making Ripley a woman, and he said he did not change anything about the character except make Ripley female.
Yeah, that's an important part of any kind of writing, and it's a good sort of you know, litmus test, if you like, in your characterization when you are writing things. If you want to sort of double check if a character is a well-rounded character, regardless of sort of gender or anything else, you could say, okay, so if I made this character a woman, or if I made this character a man, or if I made this character gay, or whatever else, would that, you know, would that change anything? And ideally, no, is the answer, because, you know, the person's personality and what drives them and the events they have should be independent of those things, you know. So it's a good test to do. So if you've written a strong hero and you just switch it to a female character, then there should be no drama with that, if you know, because in equally the other way around, if you've written a female character and you just switch it to a guy, and suddenly this guy seems kind of lackluster and by the by and whatever else, that's actually telling you a lot more about your female characters than anything else.
Yeah, and you know, we've been talking about your female characters. They're tough and resilient women, but they're also flawed in some way, as are all human beings. But due to ingrained gender bias, readers may perceive them as quote unquote unlikable or quote unquote ruthless, instead of lauding them as likable or determined as they would if they were male. Do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural expectations to make your female characters likable or relatable? And do you ever get any flack from readers for not making a female character likable enough?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's always I see. I have a fundamental issue with the, you know, with the basic premise of that in the first point, especially with horror and thrillers and dark fiction and stuff. You know, characters don't have to be likable. You don't have to like someone to enjoy their story. A lot of the time, one of the most powerful parts of horror is having you empathize, not necessarily sympathize, but having you empathize with people who are not pleasant, because that's the trick of, like, really sort of delivering those, like, moral and ethical questions, and those kind of, that sort of cathartic confrontation of fear that you have when you read horror. Um, if you empathize with someone doing terrible things and question, what would I do in that situation? Would I be a terrible person if I did this to protect myself or protect my family? All those sorts of questions that we raise in horror. That in some cases that precludes the characters from being likable. And so you always, you know, you'll quite often get people that will review a book or something and say, oh my God, there was nobody in this book that I liked. I couldn't root for anyone, kind of thing. And then you'll get another review of the same book going, oh God, this was amazing. Every character in this was such a horrible person. It's such a compelling story, you know? So you really can't please everyone in that respect. But I think it's important that you don't strive to make everyone likable, because you don't have to like characters to be invested in their story. But equally, each character does need to be fully sort of three-dimensional and fleshed out and compelling.
You think it might be, you brought up an important point that, this applies to horror, but we have heard from, authors, especially female authors who write in other genres like YA fantasy, like, epic fantasy and all, and they, and science fiction. And they did note that, there was pressure there to make the female characters more likable. You think it's genre? Because like you said, with horror, no one needs to be likable. They just need to be
Well, it
compelling.
can be as well, but I mean, it's also, there's people need to check their sort of double standards as well, because if you're enjoying a story and there's a male character and you're like, oh my god, this guy's such a bad guy, it's, it's so interesting to, he's so bad, he's so rough, it's such an interesting story to read. But then if the same character was a woman, you go, oh, she's a bitch, I can't relate to that. It's like, well, you're actually bringing your own kind of like gender stereotypes to that, because there's the idea that male characters can be bad, and female characters have to be likable, is something that tends to crop up quite often, and it's something that I think we need to move past. You can have anti-heroes who, male or female, and should be as compelling as each other. And I mean, most of the time a review does say a lot more about the reviewer than it says about the book. And so this is often the case when it comes to these sorts of things, when everybody brings themselves to a story. Everybody brings their own existing biases and interests and whatever to a story. That's what makes fiction so powerful, because 5 people can read the same story and have 5 wildly different experiences. But I think there is, in some cases, there is this kind of drive for people to try to make characters more likable, because people think that likable means relatable, which is not necessarily true. But I think there is definitely still a strong bias towards making female characters more likable, and male characters can be as bad as they like. And I think that's a problem that we need to continue to address and get past.
Yeah. And, here's the thing that we noticed. As we can see from the hashtag men writing women, not many male authors, not saying not many, but many male authors can't seem to portray female characters well. Even best-selling male authors like Brandon Sanderson have talked publicly about how they initially found it difficult to write women well. And it took a lot of work before they could actually write compelling and complex female characters. And I've read quite a few of your books, starting from your early work until now. And we notice a slightly similar trajectory in your books. And when your earlier books have mostly male protagonists, but your more recent books from 2018 onwards have really great male-female teams of, teams of protagonists, one male, one female. So did you face any particular challenges in writing women well when you first started writing?
Not really that I was consciously aware of, I don't think. There is certainly a degree of, you write what you know, and obviously you can't only write what you know, because you'd run out of stuff and get boring pretty quickly. So you sort of have to learn more and figure out more as you go along. But I think probably in early work, I was probably writing, I wasn't just writing for men, I was writing for everybody, but I probably was writing from a more male perspective, and still finding my feet as a writer in a way. And then the more you write, the more stories you tell, the more you think about what sort of stories you're telling. And I started sort of publishing 15 years ago, and over the course of that time, I think everyone's become a lot more aware of trying to have a broader representation in what you're writing about. And I'm very much of the belief that the way to write good, strong women is to basically just remember that women are just people, the same as everyone else. And so you write good, strong people, you write good, strong characters. And then, I can't write from a perspective of what it's like to be a woman. I can't write from a female perspective, but I can certainly write from the perspective of a strong character who is driven and motivated, and what their reasons for being driven and motivated are, and all those sorts of things. And I think as I've written more, I've tried to, I've learned more as well from feedback and from the world around me about making sure that we do sort of represent the world around us in our stories. And my world is populated by men and women, so lots of different nationalities and genders and sexual orientation and all that sort of thing. I know people across the board and all those things, and so I want to make sure that the stories I tell reflect those things. And so I
It's a
definitely
good
have.
trajectory, though. It's a good
Sorry.
trajectory. I mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't bringing it up to criticize you, but I thought it was a really good trajectory. And the important. And here's an interesting thing. I've told you before that I'm, the Read for Pixels team. We have specialists in different genres, and my specialisms are romance and horror. Which is why I'm hosting you today. And I've noticed a similar trajectory in romance as well. And this is something that, people in romance land there talk a lot about. As in, 15, 20 years ago, issue of consent really wasn't there in many books. And then it just grew, it changed for the better. And I think reading your books from your early work until now, it was really nice to see how you've grown as an author. When in terms of portraying women. And
well, I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, I think it's really important to always try to be better, like as a person in general, as well as as an author and in the stories that we tell. It's like there's a certain mindset who are like, oh God, the world is changing, I don't like it, everything was fine in my day. It's like, well, it might have been fine for you, but it wasn't fine for everyone. And if we can be more inclusive, and if we can appeal to more people and be less harmful in what we do by paying attention to how the world around us is changing, I think that's important. And I want to reflect that. I want to continue to grow as a person, and I would hope that my fiction and my books grow in a similar way. So I mean, it's good to hear that. I mean, yeah, it's in the first and foremost, I want to tell a good story. I'm trying to entertain and tell a good yarn, but I do always try to stay aware of the world around me and what's happening and how we can make it better. Or I don't want to perpetuate old systems of harm. If I can do anything to help break those and move things in the right direction, then I want to do that.
Yeah, and why do you think horror authors still have some trouble? Well, some horror authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are many more things that women talk about other than men. I mean, in horror stories, you can have the women talking about the monster, which has no gender or whatever. But I've read some horror books, and it's like it's still talking about men all the time.
Yeah, I think all genre fiction to some degree. I mean, maybe horror has a bit more of this. There is a sort of like an old sort of established process that people don't really want to look past. That I think there's a certain percentage of authors who are not that interested in interrogating their own process, or where they are in the world, or how the world is changing around them. There's still a lot of horror that just basically focuses on sort of rape and murder and shock and motivation through those things, and it's kind of a little bit sort of by the numbers kind of a process of writing horror, and that just tends to perpetuate the old stereotypes rather than looking forward and addressing things and updating things.
All right. Sorry, Alan, you actually dropped out for a moment there, and I'm explaining to the audience that you live in cow country.
Yeah.
You live in a rural area, so yeah. So what were you saying? Because you actually literally the screen went blank.
Sorry about that. Yes, that's my internet has a little freak out every once in a while. I apologize. Yeah, no, I was just saying that I think within horror that there is a sort of an old guard who think that what makes horror is what made horror back in the day, and there's a lot of basically rape and murder and violence, and those are the motivating factors, and that's what horror is, instead of what most of us thankfully, hopefully, are trying to do is reflect the world around us as it develops and as it grows, and still tell more interesting stories and develop more complex narratives and more complex characters. But I think there is definitely a certain, thankfully small, but certain percentage of people working in the genre that basically stick to those old methods, because it's kind of formulaic in a way, and there's an audience for that as well, but hopefully continually less.
Yeah, it's we work with we now have you as a Read for Pixels author, and we've worked with like Paul Tremblay and Stephen Graham Jones and Nicholas Kaufman, and all and there's one thing like we have we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the session, but we have a charity anthology that's mostly horror. Alan, yeah, so you paused again there. There's this remark that Stephen Graham Jones left a personal note at the end of his story, and he talked about how in high school he had a female classmate who came to school with bruises and all, and he asked how he could help, and she said, as many domestic violence victims do, oh, nothing, it's nothing, it was, he just got angry, and so Stephen hadn't seen his classmate for many years now. And he said he often thinks about her, and now when he writes stories about women facing abuse, which he does in many of his stories, he says he puts a frying pan or a 2x4 in her hand and makes sure that the story ends differently. And so that's the beauty of horror. You can do that.
Yeah. That's the thing we can do, like the whole point. We should, fundamentally, we tell each other stories to interrogate the world around us. And if all we're doing is telling stories about the world that was rather than the world that isn't, or the world that could be, then we're sort of doing a disservice in terms of story, I think.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about story and storytelling later, but let's talk about the male characters in your book. So they range from Isaiah and Alex Cainne, who use their powers to fight against a range of horrors, including violence against women, to Riley Brent in Sallowbend, who is an outright domestic abuser. Additionally, the relationships between your male and female characters in your recent books and series, such as Hidden City and The Rue, are pretty equitable, with the men working closely and respectfully together with their female companions and colleagues. So do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways that horror writers can break away from horrible tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've got a short novel you mentioned. It's called The Rue, which is basically, it's a short novel about a demonic kangaroo that decimates an outback town. It's a straight up creature feature. It's a horror B movie, but the core of that is looking at isolation and domestic violence and toxic masculinity. Like these, we can address these things, and it's not, there's no sort of preaching on the page, but this is where the stories grow from, and it's really important to me to have a wide variety of experiences, particularly for the male characters rather than the male stereotypes. Sallowbend is a good example in that respect, that the whole story is from the point of view of two main characters, one being Trisha Brent, who I read from, and the other being Caleb Jackson, who's the janitor at the school, and they team up to sort of figure out everything that's going on, and they have a really interesting and complex relationship where they help each other, but particularly Trisha helps Caleb deal with a lot of his issues. But it's an entirely platonic relationship on their part. They're just two people who look out for each other and help each other and see each other through this horrible situation that's going on. And a couple of people have said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see that there was no like romantic entanglement for those two characters," and that was deliberate. Like, just because you have a male and a female character, they don't have to end up in bed together. And it's small things like this that you can start breaking down stereotypes of what things are. There's another scene in that book where three guys have to deal with a really horrible situation, and they sort of acknowledge that to each other and talk about it afterwards, rather than just kind of sucking it up. Like they do it in a very sort of male way, but they draw attention to the fact that they've all just been through something together and things like that. So I think it's important that when we're writing our male characters, we write characters who are strong and capable and motivated, as well as being sympathetic, as well as being people who can express their emotions, who can, men who can cry when they need to, and all these sorts of things. Because if we present those as regular characters in our stories, then we are, again, reflecting the world around us and sort of interrogating the world that we want rather than potentially the world that is. So for me, strong male characters are not just, the old kind of pulp superheroes of old. They're complex and interesting people who have flaws and have emotions, and the best among them are okay to display those emotions and things like that. I think that's how we start to address those issues. You can be a hero and you can be a badass and you can cry when you need to. All those things are, they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and in two things I've observed is, in real life, if you keep stuffing things down and not talking about it in some way, you're going to explode at some point, or you're going to have issues further down the line. Well, not literally explode, and also it's not realistic if, three people or however many people have gone through a horrible thing that they have to do and not talk about it. Like, not even refer to it. It's not natural, is it? I mean,
no, that's right. But a lot of the time in the old days, if you like, that if guys would do this, they'd be like, oh right, well, no, don't talk about it, suck it up, stiff up a lip, be strong. When what's actually strong is to say, oh God, that was horrible, I feel terrible, are you okay? There's a lot more strength in that in the long run than pretending something didn't happen. So yeah.
Yeah, and also when you think about friendships or community relationships, if you don't say anything, are you okay, after a really horrible incident, it's not great, is it?
Yeah. I mean, if we show people caring for each other in stories while still facing the darkness and potentially triumphing or whatever, then we remind everyone reading that it's okay to talk about those things as well as still face them and whatever.
Yeah. So let's talk about, story, and it's one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. And as you were saying, horror stories, part of what you were saying is horror stories they all feature some sort of violence, and that's what I noticed as well in my many years of reading horror. And more often than not, violence against women. So the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in horror. Many subgenres of horror include graphic scenes of rape and sexual assault of women and girls as a staple shorthand for creating a violent and scary story world. And you mentioned a bit about that earlier in our chat. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
Yes, some have, definitely. There are still people who think that the best way to write horror is through things like violent rape and stuff like that. And to me, that's incredibly lazy and sort of boring storytelling, and it's basically perpetuating stereotypes. And it's not it's not clever, and it's not interesting, um, and it's not even necessary really anymore. There are certainly times, and particularly in horror, where there are often horrible people doing horrible things. There will be situations where violence is committed against other people, and frequently violence that's committed against women is often in the form of rape among bad people. That's a truth of of our existence. But if that's kind of the only way that violence is portrayed in a story that you're writing, or if that's the only violence that you're using in your story in order to sort of move the plot along, then I think that's really boring and lazy, and not really very reflective of the real world, because it's such a narrow focus on the real world. And I think a lot of people are doing a lot better at addressing that and finding other ways to, finding other stories to tell and other ways to motivate people. So I think, on the one hand, violence against women is very much a real thing in our society, and then absolutely that needs to be reflected in our stories. But if that's the only thing in the story then that's kind of boring, you know. Like, yeah, that life is more complex than that, and violence against women exists in a world with lots of other stuff that goes on, and so your stories need to exist with lots of other stuff going on as well, I think.
Think if you include violence against women in your stories, you need to make sure it counts and it's not a plot widget.
Yeah, I mean, if it's purely there as a, you know, to move the plot along, then it's lazy. Like, if you're telling us, you know, a lot of horror these days as well still perpetuates that thing where it's basically like a revenge story. They're like, okay, so horror is this horrible thing happened to this woman, and now she's going to go and she's going to wreak her revenge. She's going to do horrible things to these men. And it's like, no, this is a strong, powerful woman, you know, like this is a story about a powerful woman who's getting her revenge on these horrible guys. It's like, well, yeah, but your entire premise is based on this woman being violently raped, which is boring. Like, it's been done so many times, and it's not necessarily an interesting story to tell anymore, because violence against women and violence in general is usually a lot more complex, and, you know, has a lot of other factors involved of why people are doing what they're doing and how they've got to those points. And that's a much more interesting story to tell, and that's a much more interesting thing to sort of reflect and confront in storytelling. So
Yeah, what's interesting to me is I mentioned our charity anthology, and it's all about the Twilight Zone meeting promising young woman, and when we got this, when we invited the authors to write those stories, a lot of them had to sit down and really, really think about it. How are we going to tackle this? Because, like you say, in horror, you can't just dial it in by the numbers.
yeah,
And
yeah.
you know, have a
It,
good
it,
think about what your story is going to say about the issue of violence against women.
yeah, and, you know, if you've got the violence, and none of the foundation, then it becomes, almost sort of gratuitous in its own way, because these things don't exist in vacuums. Like with Sallow Bend, you know, it's implied in that first bit, or the second part that I read, the first bit from Riley's point of view, where he's clearly dealing with some really deep levels of guilt and self-hatred and stuff that are going on, that's driving him, and has, you know, that has driven his decline to such a degree. It's clear that he sort of knows something more about what happened to their kid than his wife does. And that's developed through the course of the book, along with the rest of the story that's told. You know, the truth of their whole family history is also drawn out in the book. And so if you're telling stories where, you know, people don't just randomly, or they do, I suppose, to some degree, but generally speaking, people don't just randomly turn to violence. People have a history of something that drives them to be the people that they are. And so if you're telling stories about that, then you kind of owe it to the story, and you owe it to the reader to explore the reasons for it, not just the result of those reasons. You know?
Yeah, and you're right about the history thing, because domestic violence, often you'll find that the abuser has come from a family with a cycle of domestic violence. It's
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah,
history.
often the case is that abuse and violence is perpetuated, and, you know, like, angry sons are usually the sons of angry fathers, and this sort of thing. You know,
Yeah,
like this, and breaking, or in the first instance, becoming aware of this cycle, and in the second instance, what we can do to break that cycle, is probably the most important thing that we're dealing with these days, especially when it comes to violence against women. It's, you know, most of the time, most violence against women comes from the hands of men, and it's not a women's problem. It's not a problem for women to fix. It's a problem for men to stop doing. And so and the issue is for men to raise better sons. So, you know, in the long run, that's what addresses violence against women.
yeah. So we do have a question from the audience now that we're talking about writing and storytelling.
Mm.
And the same person also donated to get your bundle. So thank you so much, Emilian Givkovsky. I hope I
Ah,
pronounced your name correctly. So, because of the character, the limit on YouTube comments, I'm going to share two comments from him. consecutively. So Emilian says, "Hey Alan, I've just come back from a few days down in Phillip Island in Victoria just to recharge from work and life, but also to give me time to do some writing of poems and short story. The question is, I'd like to spend more time doing this as a hobby for now. How do I set aside more time for this?"
Wow, Emilian, that's the great question, isn't it? There's I mean, the only answer is really the trite one, is that you just have to make time to do it. If there's something that's important in your life, if it's a hobby or if it's a job or if it's family or whatever else, if there's something that you want to be a part of your life, you need to make the time to do it, because it's incredibly frustrating. Quite often, people, "Oh, what do you do?" "Oh, I'm an author, I'm a novelist," this, that, and the other. People go, "Oh, I'd love to write a book, but I just don't have the time." It's like, well, nobody does. I didn't have the time to write a book. I had to make time to write a book because it was something I really wanted to do. And so that's where it becomes important. And you kind of have to say, well, this is important to me, so time to do this is important to me. Like, I have to go to my job from this hour to this hour. That's the thing I have to factor in. I spend time with my family in these times. And so you have to pick some time to go, this is when I'm going to work on my writing because this is important to me. And you make that time available. And it doesn't have to be a lot. I get very frustrated with this, you have to write every day and all this stuff. It's not true. I don't write every day. A lot of us simply can't. We've got work and families as well as the writing that we do. But even if it's 1 hour on a Sunday morning once a week, or an hour each evening after the kids are in bed or something, you need to decide when you're going to do it, and you make that time as important as the other things in your life, and you do it. And it's the discipline to make the time and do it is how you do it. You need to find the time where you have to create the time. You're not going to find the time because we're all busy.
Yeah, well, there's the other tip that Chuck Wendig gave in his, books about writing, if I can share it. He basically said, well, try and get 200 words out every day. 200
Yeah,
words, 2
yeah.
paragraphs.
Dave Wood, who I co-write with sometimes, he'll sometimes do what he calls a writing sprint, and he says, right, this is the sort of story I'm working on or whatever. I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to get as many words out as I can in 10 minutes. So you just sit down. You don't think about it. You just sit down and start writing. And he'll say quite often that might turn into half an hour or an hour, and I'll write 1,000 words, and then I'll come back to it the next time. And he'll often use that as a motivation to go, I'm just going to do this now. I could turn the TV on for an hour, or I could just sit down and do it, and just do it. So
For 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes, exactly. It's like, I've got to go and pick up the kids from school in 20 minutes. I don't really have time to do anything else. It's like, well, there's 20 minutes. Sit down and just write 100 words if you can. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. There are authors who are women as well, and I'm just throwing this out there, who, they have a lot of things to do. They have children to raise and all that. And they've locked themselves in, one author, Anne Rice. Yes, she said that when her children were growing up, she literally woke up at 4 a.m, locked herself in the toilet and in the bathroom, and started writing.
Yeah.
That's
I wrote my
dedication.
first novel my first 1.5 novels really during my lunch hours at work, because I was working a 9 to 5 admin job. I was teaching and training with the martial arts every evening. I basically didn't have any time, but what I did have was a lunch hour 5 days a week. So Monday to Friday, in my lunch hour, I would make a sandwich, sit at my desk, and I would work on the book for an hour. And I wrote a novel and a half that way before I ended up moving into different jobs and stuff. It worked out probably about 40 minutes in the long run of each lunch hour. So 40 minutes 5 times a week, and I wrote a book. So yeah.
Okay, so that was today's audience question. So let's talk about geek culture, which includes speculative fiction such as horror, fantasy, and science fiction. Well, geek culture in general has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors and creators. Plus, there's still plenty of hostile, misogynistic, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
It needs more men to call out the other men who are the ones gatekeeping and making the women feel unwelcome. This is another example where it's not a woman's problem. it's a man problem, and it's up to men to fix the problem. So really, it's about men lifting up women's voices and centering women's work and creativity, in spite of the vocal, hopefully ever dwindling minority of people that just have an issue with women in any kind of geek culture. It happens across, it's not just geek culture. It happens in, science. It happens in different sports. It happens in all sorts of things where people sort of seem to think that you can be a male fan, or you can be a fake geek girl. It's like you can love as much or as little about a thing and be just as valid a fan of that thing, regardless of who you are. And it's an issue for guys to center that perspective. It's, if there are women who are making cool things in any kind of geek sort of centric culture, it's up to us to center and promote those things. It's up to us to raise women's voices. It's up to us to call out men when they're acting sexist and patriarchal about this stuff, and say that's bullshit, that's not true. It's in the same way that it's up to men to raise better sons in terms of violence against women. It's up to men to call out other guys when they're being exclusionary in any form of sort of geek culture and those sort of situations. So yeah, I know. I do what I can. I try to make sure that I sort of promote and give space to everybody equally in the stuff that I think is cool. And if I do see people, acting in that sort of misogynistic way, I try to call it out. If I can use what small platform I've got to address that in any way, then I think it's important, and more guys need to do that.
And what these toxic male geeks don't understand is, pop culture and geek culture, it's not pie, it's infinite. Everybody can, it's not
Yeah,
pie.
nobody's taking a slice. They're just also there.
They're also there, and they're really loud, aren't they? I mean, She-Hulk is showing right now on Disney Plus, and the number of really quote unquote offended male geeks railing about it and giving it a thumbs down. And sometimes you
Yeah.
wonder, why do they really have that much time on their hands to?
Yeah, it comes from a place of insecurity and fear, as well, that they feel like in some ways, something that's theirs, like you said, it's not pie. They feel like something that theirs is being taken away. But it's not, like there's room for everyone. Like everybody, whoever they are, can enjoy a thing to whatever degree they want to enjoy a thing, and it affects your enjoyment of that thing 0%. Like it's not taking anything away from you or your enjoyment of that thing. There's absolutely no reason not to share. We just need to promote that point of view, I think.
I mean, if you don't like what someone likes, you go like what you like. I mean, I don't like grimdark fantasy, and I don't say anything. Like, go enjoy your grimdark. I'm gonna sit over here and enjoy, horror or something like that. So
Yeah. I mean, that's how it goes. I'm a strong believer in the sort of principle of, if you love something, you talk about it a lot, and if you don't like something, you just don't. Because there's no point in. There seems to be a real need for a lot of people to talk about what they don't like, and that's weird to me. It's like, oh, who cares if you don't like it? Somebody else does. So if you don't like it, move on. Talk about what you do like, and then you can share that positive experience with other people who also like what you like. So
yeah, I mean, don't yuck on someone else's yum just because you're being a misogynistic. I'm not gonna say a bad word. So
yeah.
it's
But you're right. Exactly.
yeah. So, you're talking about how it's violence against women is a men's issue, and men should call other men, hold other men up to decent standards. So let's talk about parenting, because it's the kids are where we also should start with this influence. So parents are usually the most influential male role models in a person's life, or at least at the first ones. So as a father yourself, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in the future generations, and to get boys involved in helping to do so?
In the first instance, by being a good example. You can't just talk about stuff. You have to act it. You have to live it. Like kids reflect what they see around them. If they see someone who's okay with yelling at women or hitting women or anything else like that, they're going to grow up with that same mindset. If they see someone who intervenes if someone's being mean to a woman, they're going to grow up with that mindset. So, you know, it's in the first instance, you absolutely need to set the example of being kind and inclusive and supportive, and you know, recognizing that women are equal and strong and everything else, and perpetuating that through your actions, and also perpetuating that through the way you interact and talk about other people. It's been it's sort of shocking, not shocking, I suppose. I'm not really that surprised by it, but it's really sad to see that, you know, my kid's just coming up 9, and already there are other kids in his school showing that, so already showing those signs of entrenched sort of patriarchy and that sort of toxic masculinity coming up, and you can just see that they're reflections of their fathers, and you know, reflections of the other male role models in their lives. And equally, you can see that other kids who are so much more inclusive and respectful and whatever else. And so on the whole, it's quite positive. There's a lot more balanced and sort of decent kids around, and thankfully, in my experience so far, the kids showing those signs of perpetuating the toxic traits are definitely in the minority. But it is equally, it's still kind of sad that it still exists. And all we can do really to address it is through example in what we do and what we say and how we act and what we let go past. If you know that what you ignore is a standard you accept. If you see someone being unpleasant to a woman and you ignore it, that's the standard you've chosen to accept. If you address it, or even if you can't do anything about it at the time, but you then talk about it with the child later and go, that wasn't okay, you know, there's all those sorts of things we need to do to basically change that perception. But mostly it comes through action, because, you know, children grow up especially when they're young, as a reflection of the world around them. They'll develop their own ideas, obviously, as they mature, but if they're developing ideas based on a foundation of this entrenched misogyny and sexism, then they're going to have, their ideas are going to be colored that way. So
yeah. So we come to a final question of the day, and it's a Captain Obvious question, but we asked this of all the authors that we've invited to Read for Pixels. So you have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So why do you support the cause to end violence against women, and what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls? So final word on all of this. Your final.
It comes down to the same thing as, I guess, what we just said about the kids. We need to set a better example, and we set that example in how we interact. We set that example in the stories that we write. We need to. The world is a better place when there is less meanness and hatred and more inclusion and equality. Like, it generally is better for everybody when it's like that. And so we need to just try to address those things. And, you know, even as authors, if we're at conventions or shows and, you know, there's an all-male panel, give up your spot for an opportunity for a woman to speak on that panel. If you're asked about, if you're a male author asked about women's issues, say, well, why don't you go and ask women about that? You know, like, we need to, in how we live our lives and how we tell our stories, we need to reflect the world that we want to see around us, as well as reflecting the world that there is around us, you know. And it's, you know, it's not, writing good stories is not an easy job. If you want to be lazy and just write rape fantasies, then you're going to find an audience, but it's going to be really boring. Much better to try to address what is actually going on around you and try to project what might be a better world for people. And we can absolutely do that with horror the same as we can with anything else.
Yeah, and you know, your rape fantasy, you know, audience that likes to read rape fantasy is also shrinking, basically.
Thankfully, it is, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little comment from Emilian. He says, that was awesome. Thank you. Please pass on my thanks for that advice from both Alan and the facilitator. Thank you for being with us today, Emilian. So I'm going to stick myself back on screen. Hi, everybody. I'm the disembodied voice that's been having this chat with Alan, talking about all sorts of things to do with horror and violence against women, and being good role models to kids. So Emilian has donated to get Alan's Scary Good Horror Goodie Bundle.
Excellent.
But if you would like a treat from Alan and you would like to donate to us, there's still 2 goodies left. One is for donors in the US and Australia only, and it's to name a minor character in Alan's next horror novel. Do you have any idea what that novel's going to be about yet, Alan?
I'm actually working on it at the moment. It's a small town coming of age horror novel. It's set in Moncton, which is the fictional town south of the fictional town of the Gulp, Culpeper from those books. It's not really connected to the Gulp, but I'm just using the same sort of fictional geography. And it's a story of a man and his son who move to the country for reasons, and strange things occur while they're there. So that's the one I'm working on at the moment. So whoever chooses a name will become a victim to the darkness in Moncton at the moment.
Yeah, you're going to die a really memorable death. Oh, Alan's going to try and make sure you die a memorably grisly death that will be talked about by horror fans for years to come. And horror fans are not easily shocked. So that's a challenge there for Alan himself. And Alan will send you a first edition copy of the book with a signed book plate when it's released to keep as a memento. And if you are in Australia, Alan will sign your book as well. So, but if you're in the US, Alan is going to order the book separately and send you the signed book plate to go with it. And the second goodie that's still available is Alan's 30-minute Zoom session for writers. You've gotten a little bit of a taste of that just now. Alan was giving Emilian, God, my COVID brain is not working today, Alan. It's advice. Yes, the word is advice. If you're a novice horror, supernatural thriller author struggling with making sure that the spooky factor in your stories are on point, you can have a 30-minute one-to-one Zoom session with Alan, which is going to be an intensive workshop during which you can ask Alan for his secrets and solutions for the challenges of writing truly scary stories and pulse-pounding thrillers. And Alan is happy to answer general questions about writing and publishing if you have them. So the workshop will be half an hour. So who knows? You might get chatting and chatting. Who knows? And the workshop will be conducted in English, and it's open to individual writers or writing pairs, because we know some people write in pairs, just like Alan, you write some of your books in pairs with another author, don't you?
Yeah, me and David Wood have written 8 books together now, and we've got a couple of series that we write together, which is good fun. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to co-writers, or I can chat to a writers group or a beta reading group, anything like that, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and there are also plenty more author goodies available from authors such as Namina Forna, Rin Chuperko, Daniel H. Wilson, Kwame Mbalia, Sue-Ann Jafarian, Sujata Massey, Eugene Bacon, who's another Aussie author. She's African-Australian. Charlie Ann Holmberg, Tor Books UK, Random House Children's Books, and more. And we've raised 1,000, well, let me check, because Emilian has donated, so it should be reflected now. Hang on, everyone. Right, we have now raised $1,885 to its $5,000 goal so far. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends on October 2022. And if you're interested in the writing workshop from Alan or the Tuckerization, there's pretty much all on the top of the page, should be. So I'm going to share the link. Dear link, please come up. All right, you should be able to do it at the stream. Yes, here we go. You can go donate for goodies via Rally Up through tinyurl.com/R4P Rally Up 2022. This is case sensitive, and Anusha is also sharing the link in the chat box. You can find out more about Read for Pixels at bit.ly/Read for Pixels. This is case sensitive. So when you type it all in, please make sure you include the capital letters where they are relevant. And also, there is also the classic edition of the Pixel Project's first anthology, charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, that's out now. And I'm going to show you the book cover. So it's available now from Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and all other major booksellers worldwide. For more information about the anthology, go to bit.ly/Giving the Devil His Due. And also, we've also teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer an exclusive limited edition anthology bookplate for buyers. Each author will sign 16 bookplates and they'll be first come, first served. Each bookplate includes a resource of domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in 205 countries, including Australia, where Alan is. And to score a bookplate and for more information about the anthology, go to bit.ly/Giving the Devil His Due. And for those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of the anthology, you can order it from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. And all net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. And to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. I'm going to take this off screen. So, Alan, do you have any announcements that you want to make before we wrap up?
No, not really. Just be nice to each other. Buy a copy of Salad Ben if you want some new slow burn folk horror. Otherwise, just my website is just my name.com.au, alanbaxter.com.au. So you can always swing by there and you'll find all my social links and everything that's going on. So feel free to come and find me on Twitter or elsewhere and track me down and see what's going on.
All right. So thank you, everyone. And Amelia will be in touch with you via email. So please check your inbox soon and we'll get things rolling for your goodies. So thank you so much for being with us today, Alan. And everyone, please, thank you for joining us and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.